All right, let's get this on the road, shall we? Action, adventure, world building, and duck people. That is how I would describe what I just watched, which is Shangri-La Frontier. If I am pronouncing that wrong, I apologize. I'm trying my hardest, I promise. Now, this series, for anybody who wants to know, is isekai. I know some of you are already with your pitchforks. You're like, I hate isekai. It's so generic, right? Calm down. It's better than the vast majority of its genre. I would just like to point that out there. But for anybody who's not seen the show yet and wants to just get the rating and then like the video, save it in a playlist, make a comment so you remember what this video is, then watch the series, then come back and see if you enjoyed my rating, think I need to do something different, or just have something you have to get off your chest in the comments below, please let me know. And this will be the time to see the rating and then you know what to do from there. Now, as for Shangri-La Frontier, I think mainly it does the beginning category very well, which, as I will say until the end of time, right, because I will keep reiterating this and people will keep questioning my system. If you have a good beginning, you have a hook, and you have a decent main character, or at least you have a main character that seems interesting to watch, congratulations! You have a good beginning. That's all I really care about. If the premise is set up, the main character is good, and, you know, hey, if you have a hook in there, phenomenal. You get 3 points. And as for Shangri-La Frontier, I would say it definitely does have that. In the beginning, it kind of makes you think like, oh, great, we're gonna get trapped in another video game world, right? But luckily it doesn't. It's essentially just a guy who buys a video game who plays a bunch of trash video games, so when he finally plays a good one, like Shangri-La Frontier, he's like, oh my god, this is insane. You know, he has kind of like a moment of just pure relief within himself, and that was kind of funny to watch him go through an actual good game instead of a game that has a bug every 5 seconds, right? So I enjoyed that. Also the fact that it's not a life and death, world-ending, overpowered main character moment. It's kind of nice because, I mean, he is good because he's like really good at games, but he's not insanely overpowered to the point where any and all villains, antagonists, challenges are just voided because of the fact of their strange gimmick that just makes everything irrelevant, right? And then the story suffers as a result because it can only ever be a gag, right? So in this case, like within the concept of the world, there's like 6 main bosses that are essentially like these ridiculous, like over-the-top, insane challenges that the players are meant to defeat. Nobody's ever defeated one. And they're very hard to find. Sunraku, which is our main character, the Duckman himself, right? He goes and finds one called Lycagon, and he's basically just like this big wolf. And then he fights him for a while, and then he loses, admittedly, which I was happy about, that he didn't just beat the hard guy right off the bat. And then he gets like the special quest to go to Rabbituza with Emil and everything, and so you kind of get hooked into like, oh, he's gonna be able to fight all these cool mobs. And I just overall liked it. The Shangri-La Frontier world is neat. I mean, it does fall into the classic like isekai-esque thing, which we'll talk about later, but I think overall, good job, and I'll give it 3 points. All right, now, for characters, right? It's out of 6, 2 for the main character, 2 for the antagonist or antagonists/villains, right? And 2 for the side characters, right? All in all, I think the main character is stellar. I think his personality is hilarious. He is essentially just a pure-blood gamer, right? And he makes a bunch of references that I think are admittedly funny. Also, something to note is that the names of people in this series, which I kind of like, are actually gamer tags. And they make sense that they would be gamer tags, right? Like Arthur Pencilgon and stuff like that. It's very on the nose, sort of. And I kind of like that because it reminds me of Overlord, right? Where you had like the random names like Lord Touch Me or something like that, or Buka Buka Chogma, where you could tell that it was an actual gamer name and not some like grandiose thing that nobody would ever give themselves in a video game, right? So I liked the realistic nature of that element because we are in a video game fantasy world. You might as well play the game like how everybody else is going to play it. Also, Sunraku pushes the plot forward in fun and interesting ways because he is essentially a game grinder. He's an addict. He'd be chugging those energy drinks, going into the story, knocking out a bunch of quests and stuff for his, like, I guess you would call it a unique quest line, right? Like his whole thing with Rabbituza, where he goes and meets, like, Vash, or I don't think his name's actually Vash. Is it actually Vash? The big rabbit guy. Oh, it is Visash. Visash? Something like that. The big mafia boss rabbit-looking guy. And he essentially tries to teach him what a Vorpal soul is, which, if that's a reference to something that I don't get, maybe it is. I know what Vorpal Strike is, but I don't think that's exactly what they were going for. So, all in all, main character, is he interesting? Yes. Is he fun? Yes. I don't think he's exceptionally stellar, weirdly enough, and that's because I think, which I'll talk about later, I think the first season of Shangri-La Frontier is very incomplete. And I can't tell if it's how they directed the story or anything else, but it just feels like there was so much that they kind of had to set up that a lot of elements suffered as a result of that, which I think we'll get into later. But at least within the main character's case, because he is the focus of everything, quite literally the series cannot go on without him in this case, he gets the 2 points because he was a great fun time to watch. And also, fun fact, in the dub, I'm pretty sure he's voiced by the same person who voiced Sanji in One Piece. So I'm biased. But anyways, I quite enjoyed Sunraku, and I think he's overall a really great character for the story. Now we're going to get into Antagonist, and this is where it already gets tricky. Because for Antagonist, you have like Weathermon, you have like Lycagon, I guess, and then that's about it because they're the bosses, which is essentially what the setup of Antagonist is right now. And while Lycagon didn't really have all that much to do outside of the beginning, right? And kind of like the mark they put on Sunraku, which is admittedly is funny because he can't wear like a shirt anymore. So he just like looks like this really weird avatar the entire time, which I thought was hilarious considering he never takes off his like duck mask except in the final fight. There's not really much to talk about Lycagon because he doesn't really pop up in the story and he's only referenced very briefly. As for Weathermon, he's a neat idea where it's like, oh, we're going to have a super strong antagonist, right? And then they're going to be like kind of broken and it's a time battle boss, which I don't know if anybody else feels this way about time battle bosses. I freaking hate these types of characters in like video games because they're always so annoying and like at any point, like, they could just flat out kill you, right? And you have to suffer through the entire clock because there's no way to really, like, speedrun them because they're a time-based boss. So essentially how he works is you have to survive, like, increments of 10 minutes. And once you reach the 30th minute, he enters, like, his final phase where you have to survive his, like, grandiose attack. And if you survive it, destroys himself, right? Which is fun. I mean, it's a neat idea for, like, a boss battle, because you have to prove that you surpassed his whatever conquest. And another neat thing they did for him is that when you enter the battle against this guy, your level is automatically set to 50, even if you're above. But if you're below 50, you actually don't get set, like, upward, so it only, like, limits you. It never actually, like, helps you out. So they have, like, this little grinding arc in between, which was kind of funny. But I just don't think there's enough about him. And the problem is, if you're going to have a character, antagonist-wise, that is just like this big, strong, bulking kind of menace, right? You have to have a certain amount of build-up to them that's not just when you're fighting them. Because otherwise it doesn't really, like, feel any emotional connection. And there wasn't a whole lot of build-up to, like, Weathermon, because he kind of just, like, popped up when they needed to fight him and nowhere else, and there wasn't like a whole lot of hype, so his whole strength deal, you were only really getting like a idea of how strong he was within the fight itself, which I think is a little bit limiting to what you could have done with the character. And overall, I just don't think he adds a whole lot to the story other than being one of the 6. That's just my opinion. Now, also, you could bring up, like, the people who work at the game company that designed the bosses and Shangri-La, and I do think that's a fair point, but you don't really know enough of them. They're like Lycagon. You don't know enough about them to really grade them at all, because you got to see one conversation, and that's about it. And granted, they looked really interesting. Like, I thought that was cool, but you just don't know enough. So, with that being said, I think the antagonists fall kind of flat due to either the lack thereof or just like the antagonist not really being able to have the room to breathe so much in the story. So I'm going to give them a 1 out of 2. I hope the other bosses get a lot more hype, a lot more build-up, a lot more story around them, because with Weathermon it just kind of felt like, oh, we're doing this because he's one of them, and we needed to do stuff with Arthur Penselgon's story, so we just kind of threw him in there, which, you know, is okay, but not exceptionally good in any way. Now we get into side characters, and I think this is where the big problem with this story starts to shine, which is you have such a dominant main character, right? But the problem is they're so dominant that they essentially, the spotlight is always on them wherever they are. It is always permanently on this character. It can never be shifted because of how, like, their personality works in a way. And not to say, like, the personality is bad or anything, right? I think Sunraku is hilarious the entire time and a fun person to watch, but the side characters never get enough time to breathe, never get enough conversation space, character development in any way to, like, be able to combat him at all. And you could argue, like, two characters like Arthur Penselgon and, what's his name, Kay? Yeah, Kay. They could, but the problem is you never really get to know enough about them, because by the time they're in the story, it's time for the Weathermon fight, and the Weathermon fight doesn't have that much story around it except for the actual fight. A bunch of the things within the first season feel like they're only there to serve the purpose of what they are, and not multi-purpose moves within the story, which I don't really like, because you could have had a lot of interesting developments, building tension, you know, kind of having comedic relief, which the series does a lot of comedic relief, which is good. It allows people to kind of have a fondness for the characters, but, you know, at the same time, you've got to have some amount of growth. For someone whose not name is Sunraku exactly, you kind of need to do something. And Imel is good as, like, a sidekick character to Sunraku, but the problem is Imel is not every side character in the series. So you can't really grade it that high, because Imel's good, right? Because she does exactly what she sets out to do. But there's not enough for anything else, and I just feel like in 24 episodes, you should have been able to do a bit more than what ended up happening. Anyways, I think side characters wanted to. But let's see, where does that put us? The story. So, pacing, premise doesn't flow well. I like the premise because it's essentially an isekai without, like, the parts of an isekai that make you immediately roll your eyes. Going into the story like, hero, I've summoned you to go deal with the Demon King and save us. And then you're gonna be, like, super overpowered or something. And then you're gonna kill him. And, like, that's overdone. That's overdone so much that I just don't care at this point. Overpowered isekai anime protagonist does not make for an interesting character arc anymore. I know I said it here, I'm sorry. Right, I hate to be the one to, like, let everybody know, but I could not hate that type of story any more than I already do. So I do like the fact that the main character struggles in the boss fights. That also, the main character is not completely immune to the stuff that the story is doing to him. But, that being said, the story is also just very bare bones. There isn't really a lot to chew on, because the only thing we had to really go off of, other than the generic isekai fantasy world, which it does put its own spin on it, but it's still the generic isekai fantasy world. This is something we've seen before, over and over ad nauseum. So I kind of already know that, like, certain mobs are going to exist, and certain, like, item systems are going to exist, because it's kind of like the medieval era type SAO style era of video game fantasy world, right? And so I just don't find it very easy to navigate in an interesting way, because we have seen this before. And I think that hurts the story, because there just isn't a lot to chew on, since the one thing we had to chew on was the 6 bosses and the, like, video game company being a little bit introduced, and kind of the boss and the person who worked on the story and the person who worked on the game, right? It was interesting, right? And you can build a lot of story beats there, but we get to see one conversation, never again. Nothing. And for the bosses, we know they exist. We know Weathermon's story almost exactly, and we know that Lycagon exists, and that's it. So there's not really a whole lot to chew on for 24, 25-ish episodes. I think you need to put a little bit more story in there. And so I would give it a 2 out of 4. I think you could have done better. I think everybody thinks you could have done better. Not saying it's exceptionally bad, the story you have, it's just very bare bones. There's not a lot to chew on other than Sunraku himself, and a main character alone does not make for a good story. So we're building at a 4. And this is also a category that gets hurt by the isekai, right? Because in your world, you want it to be unique to your series. Number one, you want your world to feel like, oh, I can only experience this here, right? Even if it's a satire based on something, right? You still want your world to have enough twists to where it's like, oh, that's such and such's place, right? So like the idea I'm getting at is even though I haven't watched more than the first season, and I will get to a review at some point, Konosuba's fantasy world feels like its own because it's a satire and it's specifically making fun of certain things, right? Whereas like SAO's fantasy world feels like SAO's fantasy world because it has certain things about it that are very unique. Other than, like, Rabatuza, the 6 big bosses, this world has nothing. This world has quite literally nothing that separates it, which is bad, because everything else is generic and we see one time, right? We see the forest with the spider guy, right? Oh man, it's a forest with a spider boss. No, wait, is this Zelda, right? It's like, oh my god, it's Goma. And then we see a crystal place with crystal scorpions, which granted the crystal scorpions were interesting, right? But obviously if you have a sort of like rock crystal area and you don't have a crystal, like you see what I'm saying? There was nothing interesting in any of these areas. Sure, they were named, but they're not really like ever focused on in any meaningful way other than to be like the destination of a side quest, right? Sure, we can go there for something, but I want something to also happen while we're there other than for it to just be a fetch and go, right? And I think that's what the series does more than anything else, is it sets out one thing and it does the one thing. It never does multiple things, it just does the one thing, which hurts it a lot. And so, to be honest, I think the people within the game, and like, meaning the game company, right? That's an interesting level of world building, because usually you don't get to see the game developers in that sort of way, because they're mostly comedic, right? Because the writing of this story is very comedic. And that was probably the most interesting piece of it, was getting to see the story developer and the actual gameplay writer. Other than that, I think the bosses are cool, but we don't really know anything other than the bosses, and Rabatuza is neat. And that's about it. Everything else is typical. So far, granted it is the first season, so I'm expecting the world to kind of be brought up as it goes, so I'm going to give it a 3 out of 4 because they're mainly the 3 points I brought up. You have Rabatuza, you have the bosses, and you got to see a little bit of the game company, which was interesting. Otherwise, I think it very much falls flat. Now, as for the ending, right? A lot of things you could comment on, right? You could comment on the Weathermon fight, which I think is done well as kind of meh of an antagonist as Weathermon is, if you even want to call him an antagonist, because he's really just like a mindless boss in a way. And so, for him, if you're taking the ending as his story ended, that would be good. But what the anime does, which I'm going off of the first season of the anime, is it keeps going, and when you get this crystal side quest where, like, Sunraku is trying to get new items for whatever, which is, like, neat, I guess, but it didn't really set up anything or go anywhere, other than this Katsith place where they're going for a jeweler, right? And so, here's what I would think. In that moment where you're setting up all of this, you need to have flashbacks, cutscenes, either to the other 2 members of the newly created guild, where it's him, Arthur Pentagon, and Kay, and they're going to hunt down all the 6 bosses. You need to build up one of the bosses for the series end, preferably a new one, not Lycagon. You need to build up the game company people more, because they're going to know like who Sanraku and these people are who killed Weathermon, and they're going to be interested in them. Maybe they're going to make some of the bosses harder instead of nerf them now that one of them is gone. You can just build up a personality. Maybe one of the bosses is not just mindless, because the first two we've seen have been mindless. So maybe this one's a lot more influential and can interact with players in interesting ways as an NPC, which would be neat to see. Stuff like that, or maybe some guild politics, right? Ooh, you know, the Attack Masters Guild, right? They're going to start making moves towards Sanraku's guild because it's a new one, but they beat Weathermon, so now they're important, probably. Other than the library thing that happened with the character with a deep voice, which I admittedly think is funny, and I do want this to come across, right? For as much as I'm ranting about this story, I do want it to come across that I do think it is a very good isekai series. For what it is very good at what it does, which is making fun of a bunch of like gamer stuff and isekai stuff, and I like that. But if you are truly going to be a story taken to the next level, you gotta be able to add in more content, for lack of a better term at this moment, for people to actually chew on within the story itself. Because right now you have funny characters, you have hilarious dialogue, and you've got a neat world, but your story's really suffering, and because your story's suffering so bad, your characters are suffering really bad, because there's not enough story for them to actually be useful in. The only bit that's like useful in the story is always for Sanraku, right? Nobody else gets limelight except for Sanraku, for the most part, except for Arthur Penzelgon in the Weathermon fight. But even that was brief. It was so brief. And that's why I just think, you could have done more with that fight. And so that's why I think overall the ending, because you didn't really do anything with it, setup-wise, you didn't set up any of the bosses, you didn't set up the game company, you didn't set up any guild politics other than this library person, right? And, we're getting ready for us to go against the other 6, but you never show us any of the other 6. I think it's a 2 out of 3. I know, shocking, right? Even for a first season, which I would be very lenient on the ending, you have to be able to hook me in a way that doesn't make me lose interest immediately with this new library thing going on. Because I know what I want to see, and I want to see what the heck the other bosses are. And stuff like that, but if you keep, cutting it off, then what the heck am I there watching for, right? So, I'm passionate about this series because I see the potential, okay? Overall, I see the potential, and I'm just sad to watch it kind of not go anywhere, so to speak, by the end of the first season. But who knows, maybe the second, it'll clean itself all up, and it'll be a great build-up, and I will be proven wrong. But as for right now, I think overall, the story is only a 14 out of 20, which I will say for all intents and purposes, you are 4 points above mid, which means you are good. You are 70%, and honestly, that's pretty great. So, I wouldn't be too disheartened by this. For anybody who's thinking a 14 out of 20 is exceptionally bad, it's not. It means it's good. It's just, I think there's a lot more you could be doing with your story that is hampering you from being at the upper echelon. Something like Apothecary Diaries, which I reviewed recently, got a lot more story, emotion, and character writing within that 24 episode kind of space than Shangri-La Frontier did. And granted, you could say Shangri-La Frontier was more focused on the world. Fair. However, the world has to also build its characters within it, right? Other than just the concepts of world, you also have to have the world feel alive, which you need the characters for. So even if you just say, it's focusing on the world envelops the characters and they are intertwined. So a true series that focuses on world building would be able to handle both, which in this series case, it wasn't. It was able to handle the main character and aspects of the world, but not everything. But I will say, for what it's worth, very excited for the second season, which I think I heard is coming out, and I will be happy to review it as well. So I will see you in the next one. Adios. Oh, and for the openings, right? Both of them are amazing. Both of them are like top tier. I think it's Broken Games and Danger Danger. Oh my god. They're so good. They're so good.